In a forgotten Oregon town, 2 nuns vanished without a trace. 30 years later, a single cassette buried behind a confessional wall reopened a case the church tried to silence. What they found beneath the orchard would unravel decades of secrets, shame, and silence. And what one woman chose to do next changed everything. A story of faith, betrayal, and the voices that refused to stay buried. Subscribe and watch the full story now. The snow fell quietly that morning, soft as breath, blanketing the convent grounds in a pale, unbroken sheet. It covered the garden benches, the stone statue of St. Francis in the courtyard, the rows of iron crosses in the cemetery behind the chapel. From her window in the east wing, Sister Miriam watched it all in stillness. Hands tucked beneath her sleeves, lips pressed in silent prayer, though no words came. It had been 3 days since Sister Catherine and Sister Isabel left the convent walls and never returned. They had gone on foot, as always, coats buttoned to the throat, habits dusted with frost, carrying a thermos of tea and a parcel of elderberry jam for the village infirmary. A short trip, 2 hours at most. A well-worn path down the hill into Derry Glen, where they were known by name, by smile, by voice. That had been Wednesday. This was Saturday, and the tea, undrunk, still sat cooling on the table in the cloister kitchen, a faint ring of mold beginning to gather along the edges. Miriam had told herself at first that it was a misunderstanding, that perhaps the sisters had been delayed by snow, or had gone to the Abbey Library on a whim, or that they had received an unexpected call to help with a sick child. But by the second evening, when the fire in their shared cell had gone out cold and their beds remained untouched, the knot in her chest began to harden. She turned from the window and knelt by her bedside. Her knees ached. She was not as young as she once had been, but the ache grounded her, reminded her that she was still here, still present. She picked up her rosary, fingers moving from bead to bead, her prayers soft and practiced. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now. She paused. And at the hour of our death. A sharp knock startled her. She rose, smoothing her habit. The door creaked open before she could answer. Mother Agnes, tall and pale as moonlight, stood in the doorway with her hands folded at her waist. Her eyes, always unreadable, lingered on Miriam's face longer than usual. "We've heard from Constable Harrow," she said quietly. "No sightings, no accidents reported. They've checked the infirmary, the postmaster, even the train station in Clonbridge. Nothing." Miriam nodded, swallowing against the dryness in her throat. "They've vanished," she said. Agnes said nothing for a moment, then looked over Miriam's shoulder, her gaze flicking toward the window. "They've wandered off before," she said, though the words sounded hollow, even to her. Catherine was always spirited. Miriam narrowed her eyes. Catherine was precise, she said. She never wandered. Agnes gave the barest nod and turned to leave, but paused. "I'll be speaking with the bishop's office later. If this becomes something more, it must be handled with care." Miriam didn't answer. When the door shut again, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the rosary still clutched in her palm. She had lived at St. Agatha's for 32 years. She had scrubbed these floors until her fingers bled, grown herbs in the kitchen garden, buried sisters under the winter soil, and sat beside novices as they took their first vows. She knew every creaking board in the sacristy, every cold draft in the stairwell. And she knew Catherine and Isabel. She knew them like breath. That afternoon, Miriam slipped away from the common room where the remaining sisters sat with mugs of weak tea and half-hearted scripture. She walked the length of the hall to Catherine and Isabel's shared cell, the door left slightly ajar. Her hand hesitated on the wood before she pushed it open. Their room was neat, almost ascetically so. 2 narrow beds, perfectly made, a plain wooden cross above each, one Bible, one book of Psalms. The air inside still held the faintest scent of lavender oil, Isabel's doing, her remedy for Catherine's headaches. On the nightstand was a book of poetry, dog-eared and faded. Tennyson, Catherine's favorite. Miriam sat slowly on the edge of Isabel's bed. Something crinkled beneath her palm, a folded piece of paper wedged just under the pillow. She unfolded it. The handwriting was delicate but shaky. Isabel's. Catherine says we must speak to him again. I begged her not to. She believes forgiveness is still possible. I fear she's wrong. If something happens to us, please look in the orchard. Some things should never have been buried. Miriam stared at the note until her vision blurred. The orchard. She had not stepped foot there in years. Not since. She folded the paper and tucked it into her sleeve. The orchard lay behind the convent walls, past the old laundry shed and the overgrown vegetable garden. Once a source of cider and preserves, it had long since been left to rot. The trees were still standing, bent and gnarled, branches sharp as bones against the gray sky. Miriam stood at the edge of it now, her boots sinking into the wet snow. Wind whistled through the trees, low and mournful. She stepped between two crumbling stone markers, old wayposts, moss-covered and half-buried, and began to walk. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she saw it. A break in the snow. Subtle, easy to miss. But someone had stepped here recently. The snow was pressed in, edges already softening. More than one set of prints. She followed the tracks carefully, her heart beating harder now, breath rising in clouds before her. The prints ended near the base of a tall apple tree, the bark scarred and blackened by lightning from a storm years ago. At the roots, the snow had been cleared away, and the ground, dark and heavy, was freshly disturbed. Miriam dropped to one knee, touching the soil. It was damp, soft, not yet frozen. Buried. Whatever it was recent. She reached up and pulled a ribbon from her veil, tying it loosely around a branch above the disturbed patch. She couldn't dig. Not yet. Not without being seen. Not alone. But she would come back. She rose, her knees creaking again, and turned to leave. Just before she stepped through the orchard gates, she looked back. The trees swayed gently in the wind. And for the briefest second, she thought she heard her name whispered through the branches. Sister Miriam awoke in darkness. The bells had not rung yet, but the faint glow of dawn pressed against the chapel glass like an unanswered question. She sat up slowly in bed, her muscles stiff, the cold already creeping beneath her skin. The note from Isabel was still tucked inside her sleeve, edges crumpled from where she had held it through the night. Her dreams had been strange, fragments of memory, not quite her own. A door creaking open, a cry in the orchard, a voice she hadn't heard in over a decade. She lit the candle on her nightstand and reached for her journal, not to write, she hadn't done that in years, but to open it. Folded inside the back cover was a photograph. Sister Catherine, arms crossed, eyes squinting against the sun. Sister Isabel, a step behind her, her hand resting gently on Catherine's shoulder. Miriam, off to the side, caught mid-laugh. It was a moment none of them had planned to capture. One of the novices had taken the photo and left it tucked under Miriam's door later that day. Looking at it now, the image felt distant, as if it had been taken in another life entirely. Breakfast was quiet. No one mentioned the missing sisters, but their absence throbbed in the silence. Cutlery tapped against bowls. A clock ticked. Sister Genevieve, the youngest in the convent, sat across from Miriam, her red curls tucked beneath a too-loose veil. She looked up once, nervously, as if wanting to ask something. "Say it," Miriam said gently. Genevieve hesitated. "Do you think they left?" "On purpose." Genevieve nodded. "No, Miriam said. They would have told me. Genevieve looked down at her oatmeal. Some of the others think maybe they lost their way, that maybe the storm… No. Genevieve fell silent again, her spoon unmoving. After a moment, Miriam pushed her chair back and rose. The room seemed smaller without Catherine and Isabel. Its edges dulled, its center hollow. In the convent library, a narrow room of aging volumes and forgotten ledgers, Miriam moved with purpose. She ran her finger along the spines until she reached the shelf labeled 1970 to 1999. She pulled out the convent's visitor log books, stacked them on a table, and sat. Her breath caught slightly as she flipped through the first. 1989. She hadn't meant to go that far back, but something in the orchard. The phrase, "Some things should never have been buried," from Isabel's note. It tugged at her. She remembered a time long ago when whispers passed in corners and prayers were offered not for grace, but for silence. The logbook entries were neat, dated, signed in pen. Father Patrick, Archbishop Donnelly. One name stood out, Father Thomas Nolan. 4 entries, all between March and October of 1989. Then nothing. Miriam frowned. The name was familiar, but in the way that a song half heard through a closed door feels familiar. She flipped forward. 1990, 1991. Nolan's name never appeared again. By noon, a soft knock broke her focus. She looked up to see Mother Agnes standing in the doorway, her veil catching the faint light from the courtyard. "I was told you skipped lauds," Agnes said, not unkindly. "I was reading." Agnes stepped inside. "Looking for something?" Miriam hesitated, then closed the logbook gently. "Father Nolan." Agnes's expression didn't change, but her stillness sharpened. "That name hasn't been spoken in years," she said. "I think Catherine and Isabel may have spoken to him." Agnes sighed, folding her arms. "There was an inquiry," she said carefully. "Before your time, Nolan was sent here briefly during the renovations at St. Bridget's. He conducted confessions, spent time in the orphanage wing before it was closed." Miriam's stomach turned. "I remember the girl who disappeared," she said quietly. "Maura, wasn't it?" Agnes's silence said more than any confirmation. "Did Catherine know?" "She wasn't here then," Agnes said. "But yes, she found the records." Miriam stood. "And she believed Nolan was involved." Agnes stepped closer, her voice low. "She believed justice had been deferred, but she also believed in mercy. That's why she went looking," Miriam whispered. Agnes nodded. "Please," the Mother Superior said, "be careful what stones you turn over. This convent has survived because of what we've left buried. Maybe it's time we stopped surviving," Miriam said. "Maybe it's time we started remembering." Agnes said nothing. That night, Miriam lit a second candle. She unfolded Isabel's note again, reading each word slowly, as if the meaning had changed in the daylight. It hadn't. "Look in the orchard." She placed the note beside the visitor logbook and the photo of the 3 of them, then removed the rosary from around her neck and laid it beside them. And for the first time in 32 years, Sister Miriam took off her veil. The orchard was quieter than usual that evening, as if the snow itself were holding its breath. Sister Miriam stood at its edge again, the same ribbon from yesterday fluttering gently on a low-hanging branch. Dusk crept in through the gray sky, blurring the trees into silhouettes. She hadn't told anyone she was coming back. She hadn't even looked in the direction of the chapel before slipping out through the narrow gate behind the tool shed. She carried a small spade, borrowed from the greenhouse, wrapped in a rag to muffle the sound. The soft crunch of her boots breaking through the icy top layer of snow made her flinch each time, as though she might be heard. But the convent was settling for the night. The others were inside, lighting candles for Compline, chanting prayers with weary voices. Miriam had her own liturgy to conduct now. She stepped to the marked spot and knelt down. The soil, recently turned, was darker than the ground around it. The ribbon fluttered above her head like a fragile warning. She paused once more, half hoping to feel a hand on her shoulder telling her to stop. No one came. She dug. The soil gave way easier than she expected. Beneath the top layer of frost, the ground was soft, loamy. Someone had disturbed it within the last week, recent enough that the roots hadn't reformed, nor had the ground hardened completely again. Miriam's breath clouded in the air as she worked, a rhythm forming. Dig, pause, listen, dig, pause, listen. She struck something, not with a clang, but a dull thud. Wood. She cleared more soil. Her hands, raw now, scraped against the grain of an old box, no larger than a bread bin. Its edges were rough, its corners eaten by time and moisture. A simple latch held it closed. She sat back on her heels. Her heart pounded, as if she were standing at the edge of something sacred or profane. Miriam reached out, unlatched the box, and opened it. Inside lay a stack of papers, tied in faded twine, a cloth bag, 2 small photographs curled at the edges, a rosary, broken with 3 beads missing, and something that looked like a piece of children's art, a rough cross made of twigs, wrapped in blue ribbon. Miriam lifted the photos with trembling hands. The first was of a young girl, maybe 14, her face partially shadowed, standing on the convent's back steps. The other was of a group of children at play, likely in the orphanage courtyard. A figure stood watching them in the distance, blurry, but unmistakably a priest. The cloth bag contained medical reports, all bearing the name Maura Delaney. Some of them were signed, some were not. The details were vague, clinical, but something about the language chilled her. Unexplained bruising, withdrawn behavior, unresponsive to direct questioning, transferred to extended care under priest's recommendation. Miriam felt the cold in her bones now. Not from the snow, but from the knowing. She untied the twine around the stack of letters. A page near the top bore a familiar signature. Catherine. If you're reading this, we've either failed or disappeared. Maura was real. What happened to her was real. Nolan came back. Isabel and I confronted him. We thought we were careful. We were wrong. Miriam closed her eyes. Back in her room, the box sat on her desk like an uninvited guest. She had placed everything inside as she'd found it, afraid to be seen, even more afraid to forget. There was one item she hadn't yet dared touch. A cassette tape, wrapped in tissue paper, marked simply with the word, "Recording, do not destroy." She had no cassette player, but the infirmary had one, stored with the old therapy equipment, where Sister Isabel had once worked with the children who couldn't speak, yet still had stories to tell. Miriam wrapped the tape in a cloth napkin and tucked it into the folds of her habit. The infirmary was locked, but Miriam had long since memorized the location of the key. She stepped into the small waiting room, lit only by the blue glow of the nightlight left burning by the statue of Saint Bernadette. The cassette player was exactly where she remembered, on the shelf behind the cabinet of crutches and plastic rosaries. She inserted the tape, pressed play, and held her breath. For a few seconds there was nothing but static. Then a voice crackled through. Catherine's voice. "I don't know how much time we have left. Isabel is frightened. She wants to go to the bishop, but I don't trust that path anymore." Nolan's return was no coincidence. He knew Maura had written to us. He knew we had the reports. He's watching, always watching. A long pause. Then quietly, "I believe Miriam will find this. I pray she does. Please, if anything happens to us, go to the orchard, and then go to the police. Don't let the church bury this again." Miriam stood frozen. The tape continued, but she no longer needed to hear more. Her sisters had left her a map, a truth, and now she knew where to go next. It was Sunday morning, and the air in the chapel was colder than usual. The stone pews of St. Agatha's had always carried the chill of the earth, but today it felt different. Sharp, unsettled. The candles on the altar flickered strangely, though there was no wind. Sister Miriam sat near the back, rosary wrapped tightly around her knuckles, eyes fixed not on the crucifix, but on the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she felt it. Something was coming. And then, as if summoned by thought alone, the wooden doors creaked open. A man stepped in. He moved quietly down the center aisle, eyes sweeping over the pews, face shadowed beneath the brim of a dark wool hat. His coat was thick, clerical, but worn. When he reached the third row, he removed his hat slowly, revealing salt and pepper hair, deep-set eyes, and a face Miriam hadn't seen in more than 30 years. Father Thomas Nolan. She stood before she even realized it. "Nolan," she said, louder than she meant to. The other sisters turned in unison. He looked at her with something that might have passed for surprise, or calculation. "Sister Miriam," he said softly, "you remember me." "How could I not?" He smiled then, that priestly tilt of the mouth that tried to pretend at humility but never quite reached the eyes. "I came to pray," he said. "No," Miriam said. "You came for something else." They sat in the cloister garden, what remained of it beneath the melting snow. Sister Miriam kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Father Nolan sat across from her, hands resting on his knees, as still as stone. "I heard about the missing sisters," he began. "Did you?" Miriam asked. "From where?" "An old friend in the diocese," he said easily. "Said the convent had suffered a loss. Catherine and Isabel, such bright women. I thought I might offer comfort." "Your comfort," Miriam said, "is the last thing this place needs." He tilted his head slightly. "Still sharp," he said. "Still watching," she replied. A beat of silence passed between them. Then Miriam spoke. "Why are you really here?" Nolan leaned forward, his voice low. "Because I think you're starting to remember things that were meant to be forgotten." Miriam's blood ran cold. "I never forgot, Father. I simply wasn't ready to speak." "You're still not," he said calmly. "You don't understand what's at stake. This convent, your vows, your church." "Don't speak to me about vows," Miriam snapped. "You broke yours when you touched that girl, when you buried her name in silence." A flicker of something passed through Nolan's expression, something animal and fast, gone as quickly as it arrived. "You don't have proof," he said flatly. "I have enough." He stood, brushing snow from his coat. "You've always been a firebrand," he said. "It's why the bishop kept you in the shadows. Not like Catherine. She knew how to play the long game." Miriam rose as well. "She played no game. She died trying to bring truth into the light. And Isabel, if she's still alive, I will find her, and you will answer for what you've done." Nolan's eyes darkened. "You're making a mistake." "I'm making a choice." He walked away without another word, his footsteps crunching through the snow like brittle bones. As he turned the corner out of sight, Miriam exhaled for the first time in minutes. She was trembling, but not from fear, from fury. That night, Miriam returned to her room and locked the door. She opened the wooden box again, spread the contents across her desk, and pulled the cassette tape from its cloth wrap. She pressed play. This time, she let it run longer. "We went to him," Catherine's voice said, faint beneath static. "We told him we had the files, that we wanted the church to open an inquiry. He laughed, said no one would believe two nuns from a forgotten convent, said we were nothing but ghosts in habits. But we left a trail. Isabel insisted. We hid copies of everything. If he comes back, you must not face him alone." Miriam's hand closed slowly around her rosary. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She turned off the tape, closed the box, and tucked the photos back inside. Then she reached for the convent phone and dialed an old number, a retired detective who had once investigated Maura Delaney's disappearance, only to be reassigned without explanation. It rang, once, twice. Then a voice answered, tired, curious. "Hello, Detective Carver," Miriam said. "This is Sister Miriam Blackwell from St. Agatha's. I need to speak with you." A pause. "I've waited 30 years for this call," he said. "So have I." The chapel smelled of wax and ash, half prayer, half warning. It was just past midnight when Sister Miriam slipped inside. The sisters were asleep. The halls were still. Even the candles flickered quietly, as if afraid to be loud. She didn't come to pray. She came to listen. The old confessional booth stood against the wall like a relic. Dark wood, red velvet curtain worn thin by decades of grief and guilt. It hadn't been used in years. Not since the bishop had stopped sending priests to hear confessions. But Miriam remembered. She remembered the voices, the quiet sobs. The secrets dropped into the box like coins into a wishing well. She remembered Catherine, too, sitting outside the confessional one stormy evening, her hands clenched tightly around her rosary, face pale, as if she'd been the one confessing instead of the penitent. Miriam stepped inside the booth now, closed the door gently behind her, and sat in the cramped space. The wood groaned beneath her. She exhaled and ran her hand along the grain, stopping when her fingers found a narrow gap at the back panel, almost imperceptible. She pushed gently. The panel shifted. A hollow compartment. Inside was a small cloth pouch tied with black string. Miriam pulled it out, undid the knot, and poured the contents into her palm. Microcassette tapes, 4 of them, each labeled Maura 1, Maura 2, Nolan, Session 3C, Final. She blinked back the chill crawling up her spine. There had been recordings, confessions, interviews, conversations, and someone had hidden them here. Miriam didn't wait. Back in her room, she retrieved the old cassette player from the infirmary, small, beige, dusty. She inserted the first tape. Maura 1. A girl's voice, faint and trembling, filled the speaker. "He says if I tell, I'll go to hell, but I already feel like I'm there. He says my bruises are because I'm bad, that I make him do it." Miriam clenched her jaw. The second tape was worse. "He locked me in the old cellar, said it was penance. Catherine found me crying. She held my hand until morning." Miriam paused the tape and pressed her palm against her mouth, holding back a cry. She replaced the tape with the one labeled Nolan, Session 3. "You act like I planned this," Nolan's voice said, sharp. "You think I wanted to be sent here? That I wanted broken girls and delusional sisters? They came to me. They begged me for guidance." There was the sound of someone shifting. Then Catherine's voice, strong, furious. "You're a coward. You hurt her and then buried the evidence, and you will burn for what you've done." The recording cut abruptly. The final tape, C. Final. Miriam pressed play with trembling fingers. Catherine's voice was different now. Tired, resigned. "If you find this, I fear we're already gone. I tried. God help me, I tried to fix this. I begged Isabel not to go back to him, but she still believed in forgiveness. I believe in justice." A pause. Mother Agnes knew. She knew, and said nothing. Miriam froze. She rewound the tape, played it again. Mother Agnes knew. The walls of the convent suddenly felt closer, heavier. The silence around her was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. She rose, wrapped the tapes in her scarf, and walked briskly through the hall to Agnes's quarters. The door was closed. She knocked once, then entered. Agnes sat at her desk, already waiting, hands folded like a woman expecting judgment. "You listened to them?" she said. Miriam stared. "You knew. Catherine said you knew." Agnes looked down. "I knew. Parts, rumors, things I chose not to see clearly." You let him come back, Miriam said. You let Catherine and Isabel go alone to confront him. Agnes nodded once, slowly. There are times, she said, when silence feels like survival. And there are times, Miriam replied, her voice cracking, when silence becomes complicity. Agnes looked at her, tired, old, and suddenly very small. What will you do? Miriam reached into her pocket and placed the tapes on the desk. I'm giving these to Detective Carver tomorrow. I'll testify. I'll tell everything I know. And I suggest you prepare to do the same. Agnes said nothing. Miriam turned and walked to the door. You let Maura down, she said, hand on the handle. Don't let Catherine and Isabel disappear into history, too. Agnes didn't look up, but her silence was different now. It wasn't self-protective. It was shame. The sound of tires on gravel was barely audible through the wind. Sister Miriam stood near the edge of the orchard, her coat buttoned to the throat, hands buried in her sleeves. The trees, once merely bare, now felt skeletal, watching, waiting. A black unmarked sedan pulled through the convent's front gate, followed by a smaller car with Oregon state plates. From the first, Detective Carver emerged. Tall, square-jawed, older now, but unmistakably the same man Miriam remembered from the first week of Maura Delaney's disappearance. 30 years, he muttered, shaking her hand. Never thought I'd be back here. Neither did I, Miriam replied. Behind him, Detective Aisha Boone climbed out of the second car. Mid-30s, sharp eyes, her dark hair pulled into a practical knot. She carried a satchel and wore gloves already. I've read your file, Boone said, wasting no time, and I've reviewed the contents of the box you turned in. Carver added quietly, We brought a forensic recovery team. They'll be discreet. You said the burial spot was here? Miriam nodded and led them silently to the marked tree. The blue ribbon still fluttered gently. The wind was picking up. By noon, the recovery team had already unearthed the first body, wrapped in a deteriorating wool blanket, bound with twine, a crucifix placed carefully over the chest. Sister Isabel. Miriam knelt beside the grave, numb. Boone gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Dental records will confirm, she said softly. But you knew already. She would never have left without Catherine, Miriam whispered. As if on cue, a second grave marker was found. A patch of turned earth, no more than 15 feet away, partially obscured by undergrowth. Another blanket. Another crucifix. Sister Catherine. By late afternoon, the orchard had become a crime scene. Yellow tape ran between the trees like a crooked rosary. Detective Carver took notes silently while Boone spoke with the forensic team. Miriam stood beside the graves, her arms wrapped around her as if holding herself together by force. They were buried with care, Boone said eventually. Not like someone hiding a crime, like someone burying a secret they couldn't carry anymore. Miriam didn't respond. Boone continued. The way they were positioned, the items with them. Someone close did this. Miriam looked at her, cold in her voice now. It was Father Nolan. We can't prove that yet, Boone said carefully. But the box, the tapes, especially the recording where Catherine says his name, will reopen the case on Maura Delaney. Carver nodded grimly. And if we find Maura, Boone interrupted gently, we may not. After 30 years, but the orchard might hold more. As the sun dipped below the treetops, casting the orchard in long violet shadows, one of the forensic techs called out, Something else. Deeper. The digging began again, careful, precise, quiet. After another hour, the team uncovered a third skeleton, smaller, with signs of trauma to the skull and ribs. Next to it, a tarnished child's bracelet, engraved faintly. Maura D. Miriam fell to her knees. It was over. It had finally happened. Maura had been here all along. Catherine and Isabel hadn't just discovered the truth. They died trying to prove it. Back inside the convent, silence reigned. Mother Agnes sat in the common room, eyes sunken, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of untouched tea. Boone and Carver sat across from her. "I need to know," Boone said, "what you knew. And when." Agnes said nothing for a long time. Then slowly, "I knew there had been a girl, Maura, that she went missing while Father Nolan was stationed here. I suspected, but I told myself it wasn't possible, that a man of God is still a man," Boone said flatly. Agnes nodded. "Catherine came to me with papers, reports. She asked me to help her take it to the diocese. I said no." "Why?" Carver asked. Agnes looked at Miriam. "Because I was afraid, and because I knew what would happen to this place if the story got out. The church would close the convent, disgrace the order. We'd be scattered, forgotten. You were afraid of losing bricks and wood," Miriam said bitterly. "But you let lives be lost instead." "I regret it," Agnes whispered. "Every day." Boone spoke softly. "You're going to need to give a full statement. This is now a triple homicide investigation." Agnes nodded and didn't speak again. That evening, Miriam walked the orchard alone. The graves were gone now, the bodies taken for autopsy, but the space they had occupied still radiated weight, as if the earth itself was mourning. She stopped where Catherine had been buried and knelt down. "I found her," she said. "I found Maura, and I found you." Wind moved through the trees like breath. "And now," she added, "they'll know everything." Back in her room, Miriam lit a single candle and opened her journal for the first time in 20 years. She wrote one name across the first blank page, Maura Delaney. Then, underneath it, "We are not ghosts in habits. We are the memory the church tried to silence, and we will not go quietly." The headquarters of the Diocese of West Oregon loomed like a gray fortress against the drizzle. Detective Carver parked across the street. Sister Miriam sat beside him, hands folded in her lap, rosary silent between her fingers. "You don't have to go in," Carver said, watching the entrance. "I do," she answered. He nodded. "Boone's already inside. We go in together in 5. She nodded once and turned her eyes back to the building. Stone, stained glass, cold. Like the church itself, she thought. Inside, the waiting room was immaculate. Polished floors, wooden crucifixes. The receptionist, polite but guarded, led them down a long corridor to conference room B. There, already seated at the table, was Bishop Alan Thorne. Tall, impeccably dressed, his collar white as a confession sheet, his eyes unreadable. "Detectives," he said with a faint smile. "And Sister Miriam, it's been decades." "Yes," she replied, her tone sharp. "Decades during which 3 women were murdered, one of them a child." The bishop's smile faded. "I've been told you've reopened an old investigation." "We've opened a new one," Boone said flatly, setting down a folder. "Because this time we have evidence." Carver placed the photos gently on the table. Images of the box, the cassette tapes, the orchard graves. The bishop glanced at them, then steepled his fingers. "I had no knowledge of these items," he said evenly. "But you had knowledge of Nolan," Miriam said. "You reassigned him after the first complaint, then again after Maura disappeared, and again after Catherine and Isabel went missing." The bishop's expression didn't change. "There were rumors," he said slowly, "but no confirmed reports, no convictions." "You didn't look for convictions," Carver said. "You buried the truth." Thorne's voice hardened. "We protected the church." "You protected a predator," Miriam snapped. Silence. Then, softly, Boone asked, "Where is he now?" Thorne hesitated. "He was removed from parish work 10 years ago. He lives at a retreat center in Montana, under supervision. Send us the address, Carver said. We'll take it from there. You'll need a warrant, the bishop replied. You're not the law anymore, Boone said coldly, and neither is your church. Outside, the rain had picked up. Miriam stood on the cathedral steps, staring into the overcast sky. I used to think he was untouchable, she said. That they all were. They're not, Carver replied. But it takes people like you to break the silence. She looked at him, eyes tired but steady. They buried Maura, then Catherine, then Isabel, and they almost buried the truth. But you didn't let them, Carver said. No, she said. Not this time. That night, Miriam returned to St. Agatha's. The chapel was empty, lit only by candlelight. She stood at the pulpit, her voice quiet but firm. To all the sisters who were silenced, who were shamed, who were ignored, this place is still yours. She paused. To Maura Delaney, you were not forgotten. Her voice broke, but she continued. To Catherine and Isabel, you were right, and I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner. A few hours later, Boone called. They had secured a warrant. They were flying to Montana in the morning. We'll bring him in, Boone said. This is almost over. No, Miriam said softly. It's just beginning. The retreat center was perched high in the Montana foothills, snow clinging stubbornly to the edges of the gravel path as Detectives Boone and Carver stepped out of their rental car. The air was thinner up here, quieter, colder. Pines framed the sky like needles around a wound. The building itself was modest. 2 stories, old stone, once a monastery, now a hiding place. Boone glanced at the paper in her hand. This is it. Let's knock, Carver said. They didn't knock. Father Thomas Nolan answered the door himself. He looked older than Miriam remembered. His shoulders hunched, his eyes sunken, but the mouth was the same, firm, pious, polished. He didn't flinch when he saw their badges. I expected this day might come, he said. Eventually. Boone kept her tone flat. Father Nolan, we're reopening a triple homicide investigation in Mornington, Oregon. We have a warrant to search your residence and detain you for questioning. Nolan stepped aside, hands raised. No need for dramatics, he said. There's tea in the kitchen. I assume you'll want to talk. The inside of the retreat was sparse. A small fire burned in the hearth. Books lined the walls. Some religious, some psychological. Some locked away in a cabinet labeled private. Boone opened it with her warrant. Inside, journals. Old, cracked handwritten. Dates going back 3 decades. Nolan sat at the table, hands folded, still wearing his collar. You want to talk about Maura Delaney, he said. And Sisters Catherine and Isabel, Carver added. And what you buried in that orchard, Boone finished. For a moment, Nolan was quiet. Then he spoke. They were idealists, he said. Women who thought justice was their burden to carry. They didn't understand the price of mercy. Mercy? Boone said. You call what you did merciful? Nolan tilted his head. I loved Maura. In a way she never understood. She pulled something out of me. You abducted her, Carver snapped. I protected her, Nolan replied. From herself, from the world, from what she could become if someone didn't guide her. Boone leaned forward. You locked her in a cellar. You left bruises on her body. You told her silence was holy. I saved her, Nolan said. You killed her. Nolan's mouth twitched. I never meant to. Boone's voice grew sharp. But you did. And when Catherine and Isabel confronted you, what then? He said nothing. Boone opened one of the journals, dated June 1991. She came to me again. Catherine. Her eyes were full of judgment. They never understood Maura, her purity, her weakness. The orchard is still quiet, but it remembers. Another entry. Isabel screamed. Not at me, but at the truth. I told her what Maura said, that she loved me, that she understood the pain, But Isabel said I was twisted. She ran. I couldn't let her. Carver stood. That's a confession. Nolan looked up slowly. I've already confessed. To God, Boone's eyes hardened. Now you'll confess to the law. They cuffed him without resistance. As they led him down the steps of the retreat, snow beginning to fall, Nolan looked up at the sky. Will the church protect me? He asked. Boone answered without pause. No. Back in Oregon, Sister Miriam stood in the chapel, her hands clasped at her chest. A single candle flickered at the altar. The others were dark. Boone called. We have him, she said. It's done. No, Miriam whispered, eyes on the flame. Now we begin again. The next morning, news broke. Former priest arrested in 30-year-old disappearance of Oregon girl. Church officials under investigation for cover-up. 3 graves. 1 truth. The town of Mornington stirred. First in shock, then in mourning. Then, finally, in righteous anger. That night, Miriam walked through the orchard. The snow had melted early this year. The ground was soft. At the base of Catherine's tree, new shoots had broken through. She knelt and placed a single white flower at the roots. We remember now, she whispered. And we speak. The courtroom was packed. Mornington's old courthouse hadn't seen this much attention since the mill fires in '73. Now, every pew in the gallery was filled. Reporters, parishioners, nuns, and strangers who only vaguely remembered the headlines from decades ago. At the front of it all, Father Thomas Nolan, no longer wearing the collar. His suit was wrinkled, his face drawn, but his eyes, those predator's eyes, still flicked through the room like they owned it. Across the aisle sat Sister Miriam, a silver crucifix hanging at her throat, a stack of handwritten notes folded in her lap. Her back was straight, her hands steady. She had waited 30 years for this. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. They played audio recordings for the court. Maura Delaney's voice trembling with fear, Catherine's taped warnings, Isabel's desperate notes. They showed photos of the graves, the journal entries, the forensic reports. Then they called their star witness, Sister Miriam Blackwell. She walked to the stand without looking at Nolan, took the oath with a clear voice. The prosecutor, a composed woman named Helen Madsen, stepped forward. Sister Miriam, when did you first suspect something was wrong at St. Agatha's? I didn't suspect, Miriam replied. I knew. She told them everything. How Catherine and Isabel had come to her. How she hadn't believed them. How Maura's disappearance had always haunted the convent. How the confessional had hidden not just sins, but evidence. She didn't spare herself. I was complicit, she said, in my silence, in my fear. But silence is a sin when it protects the guilty. Then she looked across the courtroom. He preyed on girls because the world told them their voices didn't matter. Because he wore a collar and we were told that meant truth. But sometimes monsters wear holy robes. And sometimes it takes us years, decades, to admit we saw them. She turned her gaze to the jury. I beg you, believe the dead, because they never stopped speaking. We just refused to listen. Nolan's attorney declined to cross-examine, because there was nothing left to dismantle. The defense called no witnesses. Nolan declined to testify. When pressed by the judge, he only said, I've already faced judgment. The courtroom was silent. Even God seemed unimpressed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, no one breathed. On the charges of kidnapping, abuse, and murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant, Thomas Nolan? Guilty. On every count. Miriam sat still. Tears didn't come. Just breathe. Long, slow, cleansing breath. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. The church released a statement expressing sorrow and commitment to future accountability. But Miriam didn't care. because for once, the truth hadn't been buried. That night, Miriam visited the chapel one last time before midnight prayers. She placed 3 candles on the altar. Maura, Isabel, Catherine. She lit each one, not for mourning, but for memory. 6 months later, the orchard bloomed again. The trees that once hid bodies now bore blossoms, white, soft, trembling in the summer wind. New soil had been laid, the ground consecrated. A plaque stood at the center, in memory of Sisters Catherine, Isabel, and Maura Delaney. They were not lost, they were silenced. Now we remember. Sister Miriam read the words aloud, standing beside the new tree they had planted together. Amy, one of the younger sisters from the convent, placed a small wooden cross at its base. They should have had decades, Amy whispered, to live, to be known. They do now, Miriam replied. The convent had changed. Fewer sisters, more community work. The diocese hadn't shut it down, though they came close. Instead, St. Agatha's had become something else, a sanctuary. Young women came now not just to pray, but to speak. Miriam had started a weekly meeting in the library, Testament Hour she called it, where no one wore robes, and everyone was heard. Some stories were light, others were laced with scars, but none were hidden. One bright Sunday, Miriam took the coastal road out of Mornington. She carried a worn leather satchel, inside of which was the last of Maura's journal pages, found in Nolan's retreat after the trial. Her writing was soft, messy, sometimes illegible, but on one page, clearly written, "If someone finds this, tell them I tried, tell them I forgave, but I couldn't survive him. Please don't forget me. That's all I ask." Miriam wept reading it the first time. Now she simply folded the page carefully, placed it in a glass bottle, and drove down to Whitlow Cliff, where the ocean opened like a grave waiting to be filled with light. She walked alone, to the overlook, to the place where Catherine and Isabel had stood, to the place where Maura had died. She uncorked the bottle, whispered a prayer, half Latin, half broken breath, and tossed it into the surf. The sea would carry Maura now, farther than the convent ever could. Back at St. Agatha's, that evening's Testament Hour was unusually full. Miriam stood before the circle and told the story from the beginning. Not the case, but the girls. How Maura had loved to draw, how Isabel always burned the toast, how Catherine had once nearly left the order to be a teacher in Vermont. They were full of life, she said, and the world took it from them. But we give it back, every time we say their names. A silence followed, and then, one by one, the other women spoke. Names, memories, truths no one had dared to say before. That night, Miriam sat in her small room, the sea wind brushing her curtains. She took off her crucifix, set it on the desk, and whispered, "Catherine, Isabel, Maura, you're home now." In the distance, the sea moved, not like a threat, but like a heartbeat. Years later, a new generation of sisters would walk St. Agatha's halls. They would know the orchard as a garden. They would know Miriam as a survivor, not just a sister. They would know Maura Delaney, not as a victim, but as the spark. And when they knelt to pray, they would pray aloud, because silence would never again be sacred.